So we're here with Dr. Tracy Kosa, who I've had the chance to get to know for a few years now, but we're gonna let Tracy introduce herself. Um, and yeah, if you could, I think it'd be really helpful if everybody kind of knew your background. We often have so many attorneys and people in the legal industry, and you are, but by way of a totally different route. And so I think it would be great if everybody kind of knew how you got to this space and kind of what you've been up to in the last several years.
For sure, for sure. I'm happy to. And thank you, Kelly. I think there's nothing more awkward as a speaker than listening to someone read your bio. So I appreciate the opportunity of it myself. So I came to privacy sort of suddenly. I was on a very different academic path many years ago, about 20. And my hard drive in my very large tower from the days of the folks who remember that uh, basically just crapped out. And I was in an urgent need of getting a new one because all of my academic work was on it at the time. And so it was quite with a panic and zero due diligence that I swapped it out happily for a new hard drive and didn't think anything of it until 6 months later when I got a call from a very lovely fellow in Newfoundland, which is on the east coast of Canada, letting me know that he had purchased my hard drive on a third-party reseller market, and he wanted to know if I would like it back. And I was kind of blown away.
Wow.
It was particularly interesting because, of course, in addition to all my academic work, it also held all my financial spreadsheets, all of my weight loss plans, all of my travel plans, copies of all of my documentation and identity documents, transcripts, you name it. And originally, when he had opened it all up and started puttering, he assumed it was all dummy data. And it was actually his wife who saw the diet plan and said, that belongs to a woman and you should call her.
Wow.
So that led me down the path of how did I get here? How did I fancied myself a relatively smart person, just hand over that hard drive to someone and assume that the right things would happen and that if I couldn't access it, nobody else could, which brought me pretty quickly to the world of computers. And it was not my background at all. So I tried to pivot in the political science, political philosophy space to doing more what does computers have to do with human rights? And there wasn't a lot of room for interdisciplinary work at the time. So I went and got a job the way every good grad student does when they don't know what else to do. um, and just so happened to land myself in the beginning of an electronic health agency that had been created by the province of Ontario at the time to build an electronic health record for the province, which tells you how long we've been working on this since we still don't have one. Um, and they were looking for somebody who knew something about privacy. And because I'd done some coursework and done some dissertation work and written some papers, that was good enough at the time because there literally weren't many of us. And so I set about being a bureaucrat for about 15 years. I worked my way through every different government agency you could think of. I worked in adoption records. I worked on the child sex offender registry. I worked on subsidies. I worked on housing. I worked on roads. I worked on everything. And it really gave me the opportunity to see how privacy and context matters, how that works with regulation, and what the practical application of that is for what at the time I thought was a pretty significant scale of 10 million people living in the province. Um, but it wasn't enough. And it became pretty clear to me that I needed to learn more about computers, especially as we started to move towards to this networked computer phase where
Mhm.
governments were starting to use the internet and have emails. And what happens to all of your data then? And very quickly was very scared by the amount of data that computers can generate about us that we have nothing to do with. And at the time, there wasn't really names for those things. Now we call them metadata, inferred data, observed data, behavioral data. All of that is stuff that we have no part in creating. My computer knows a lot more about my habits than I do at this point. And so I went and studied CS. I got my PhD in computer science, which would lead you to believe that I know something about coding, which I do not. Um, I once again had to kind of cobble together a program, and that program was very much focused on network architecture and the way computers talk to each other, and mostly because I was interested in the data that was being generated at that level. And so I spent a lot of time trying to wrap my head around the bits and pieces of personal information that we can no longer control. What is created about us, what is shared about us, what is observed about us, what are patterns of behavior, and how that data could be used to influence our actions. Of course, you introduce AI to that, and
Yeah.
it becomes a whole different question. But at the time, I wasn't there. And so while working on that work, I was lucky enough to be presenting at various conferences, as you do for part of your academic engagement. And a very nice fellow from Microsoft approached me and said, you know, this work that you're doing seems kind of interesting. Have you ever thought about moving to the private sector? And at the time I laughed, which sounds as arrogant as it was. I, I had no interest in living in the United States. I had no interest in working in the private sector. And I had no interest in working at these big tech companies who at the time I really felt were the cause of a lot of these invasive privacy things that were happening. And then I had a friend who pointed out to me that I'd been invited to come and sit at the table, and I could probably make some change screaming at the building from the outside, but I could probably make a hell of a lot more change if I was actually sitting at the table. And so I decided to take it a little bit more seriously. I ended up staying at Microsoft for 4 years. I worked in the central privacy team for a few years, and then moved over into what is affectionately referred to as the law firm at Microsoft. If you're familiar with the company, they have a lot of lawyers, and
Yeah.
I'm one of the first engineers who worked there with them, which was a great experience. From
Not
there,
many people say that working with lawyers is a great experience, just note, but we appreciate that. Thank you.
well, I think it's a great experience once you learn the language. It's
Yes.
kind of like living in a foreign country, you know, you need to get a basic understanding of what's happening before you appreciate the jokes. But yeah, it was education on speed for regulation, and sort of back
Yeah.
in that space of like, how does regulation and technology work together? Um, and then off to Google, working in cloud for a few years, and then back into the central privacy team. You'll notice the theme here.
Yeah.
And then from Google, I went to Alexa, which I can very pleasantly say is still the only device that I have in my house that I use regularly, because I am quite confident in their privacy posture and what they're doing there. And then after that, I went to Meta, and Meta was again a crash course in Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, and all the other little products that they own, and what it's like to collect that kind of information about the way people interact with social platforms, and how you can change behavioral patterns as a result of having that data. So that was a pretty intense time. And afterwards, I think I was ready for a little bit of a break, hence the beginning of PrivacyAnd, which is a little LLC that I started with the sole purpose of trying to understand if I still liked privacy. Because after that many years in doing it, and a lot of basically living through Black Mirror episodes, I wasn't so sure. And what I discovered is that I do very much like privacy, but there is a very timely pivot that needs to happen in this field as a result of the new technology that's happening. The old conversations and the old paradigms don't work anymore. We need to get to a place where we start to talk about things very differently, which we'll dive into in a few slides. And I think it also allowed me to go back to focusing on the parts that I liked, which is helping activists who need to protect their location data in the interests of working on their cause, talking to students about what they're interested in and what they see as the potential future of AI and privacy in their data, talking with civil society leaders who want to reshape society so that we can address all of the issues that we had before AI that are now aggravated by AI when we consider the training sets that we're using for these machines and these algorithms and products, like predictive justice that's biased inherently because of the existing biased data sets in the system. So I've been working on those challenges, and a little bit of healthcare thrown in as well. It's been a lot of fun. Yeah. Oh, you're on mute, Kelly.
I know. So sorry. Thank you so much for sharing. I really appreciate it. You'd think after like 4 years of, COVID and Zoom and everything, you'd figure out this mute button thing. No, the journey is so unique, I think. One of the things that it really highlights for me is where we see industry and law intersecting is truly kind of where we see compliance highlighted. And I'm curious, before we get like dive too much into the compliance aspect of things, I'd love to hear more about your take on what does AI mean to you? So like when you think about in compliance, in the realm of compliance, and when you approach clients in this space, what does it mean? What does AI introduce into this space that you weren't thinking about, 10, 15 years ago?
I think that we sort of have a couple shifts, right? We started with this notion of trying to think about things like privacy and compliance when we had fax servers and microfilms and all of our paper records were what the doctor's office relied on. We shifted into this world where then we had everything digital. Then we shifted into this world where everything digital was connected. And it was still, I think, in its infancy when we talk about the data, because we could visualize it either on a hard drive or we could visualize it up in the cloud somewhere. But there was this sense of pervasive control.
Yeah.
Either you could find your data, somebody else could find your data, even in the worst case scenario where there were law enforcement activities being taken place or warrants being provided or warrantless access being provided, there was still a mental model of the location of your data. I think what AI means to me is that if we step away from the technical discussions about generative AI or whether it's independent AI or actually autonomous AI, regardless of what paradigm we choose or we think we live in, we no longer have any control. And I mean that in a very existential sense, that even the AI scholars who study in this area, people who have been experts in this field since Turing first proposed it in like the 40s, they would tell you they're hard pressed to explain exactly what's happening. We've reached a stage where
So scary.
it's really scary. I mean, and when we reach this stage where the machine is starting to train itself, and all of that is happening in a very opaque way and almost a black box of explainability. And so what that means, I think, is that compliance becomes a critical mechanism because it's the only thing left that provides a barrier or a set of requirements for, number one, slowing things down a bit so that the brains we have can catch up to these machines, and B, understanding that we're now going to have to talk about data and machines in a completely different way. We can't have conversations about use of data the way we used to. We used to have a conversation about, well, Kelly gave me this information and I can use it for the following reasons. But the truth is, once I involve an algorithm or a large learning model, I put that data in there, I can't get it back out. Never mind Kelly being able to exercise any control over it. The machine does what it does. In some senses, we can run statistical models and say there's X possibility of re-identification, but that doesn't fit into the legal paradigm of is it PI or is it not PI, right? You can't make those judgment calls anymore. So I think we have to shift the conversation, particularly around compliance. I think the other huge impact that I don't really see anyone talking about in the compliance field, and I think it's a shame, is this notion that we also now need to layer ethics into compliance in a much more explicit way.
Yeah.
One of the best examples I can think of is that early natural language processing used open source books, like books that had been no longer subject to copyright, to scan and train models. Well, if you're a reader and you've read books from the 30s, 40s, or 50s, they have an insane amount of racism and prejudice and bias in them. Women, Jewish people, people of color, you name it. That's all intrinsically built into these fiction and nonfiction novels. We've now used them as a basis to train a machine about how to recognize language. And now we're going to use that machine to provide predictive language to us or predictive responses to us or to engage with us in a spontaneous way. we're going to see that bias, that racism,
Right.
that prejudice come right back at us. Well, does it mean that we should get rid of it in the training data when it reflects the reality of the time? Does it mean that we should apply context to those answers to the machine to explain to people where it came from and why? Or does it mean we just need to start all over with a clean set of data? And in that case, what biases and prejudices are we reflecting today that 20 years from now, we're not going to want in that system? I mean, to me, a compliance person is set to think about that, because that is the life cycle of the impact and the unintended consequences. And there's nobody else in that role that can consistently impact how these products are developed.
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting question. So when you are working with these organizations, um, who, when you are asking, well, it's the compliance person that should be thinking about these, or they're best positioned to be thinking about these questions, um, what does that mean in these organizations, right? Who are those compliance people?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the truth is, it highly depends on the size of the company
Mhm.
and how many products they've got out the door already and how many users they have. I mean, even before AI became a thing, privacy always struggled to get in as an issue for a startup, which makes perfect sense. If you've only got a couple thousand customers, you are highly focused on creating a sustainable business model. You're not thinking about privacy of those customers just yet. When you grow, when you start to go through your series funding, or your venture capital firm gets involved and starts to determine what your next series will be, that's typically when those questions start to be asked. And for my purposes, I have quite a few clients who are in that phase who just don't have the money to hire somebody who can be there full time and ask those questions. They need scalable tools. They need a questionnaire. They need a list of requirements. They need things to think about, and they need it quickly and fast. And they need it not in the language of privacy or compliance
Right,
or security, right? They need it written in product language or
right.
business language, which is another unique challenge. I think when you have larger organizations, I mean, even ones like OpenAI, they have room to hire privacy people, security people, ethics people, trust people. Those are all job titles that never existed 20 years ago
Right.
and are now really clear and interesting career paths for a lot of folks. And then, of course, once you get to FANG, that's a whole other level. There's
Yeah.
hundreds of people who work in that space in all of those companies.
Yeah, it's interesting. Before I kind of continue, I want to make sure that people know, like, you're welcome to ask questions. We've got the Q&A open, so feel free to put some questions in there. We haven't had any that are super germane to the conversation, but I've answered a couple in there that are posted. But it's interesting, like, when people ask me about compliance and like, well, why would I want to kind of pursue a compliance degree separate from a JD? So this is kind of answering one of the questions in here is like, how can a master's degree, I think specific in compliance, benefit a career versus getting a JD? I don't know that the question that I would ask is like, how does it benefit different than a JD or versus getting a JD? I think that they're two different distinct choices, right? A JD is going to prepare somebody to represent people in court or in negotiations, or represent act as an attorney, right? So it's going to prepare you to sit for the bar, become a licensed attorney, whereas a master's in legal studies is not going to do that, right? Your students are not eligible to sit for the bar exam, not licensed or not eligible to be licensed to represent clients. However, the skill set is very similar in that, our students exit this program and have the tools to be that liaison in many cases between the attorneys in the room, who have a very different skill set, different level of training. But in your case, like, to your point, in often is that our Master of Legal Studies students come in with like the industry knowledge, and they want the legal training to kind of round out, and they end up being this conduit, right? So they are the people that can talk to the product people, they can talk to the marketing people, the comms people, the networking people, in a way that the attorneys, like, they don't teach that in law school, let me tell you, like, I went to law school and they don't teach that. You
I
know,
would go a step further, Kelly, and
yeah,
even say
please.
that in pretty much, well, no, in every job I've had my entire life, and this goes way before this was even a thing, lawyers are specialized. I mean,
Mhm.
and I think there's real value in that. They use a
Yeah.
certain language, they have a certain rigor around their thinking, they execute on problems in a certain way,
Mhm.
and they write and talk and think in that way.
Right.
And it is critical for a business, but there is also a reason why they are generally in their own organization, reporting to each other, reporting to a chief general counsel. There's a wall that
Mhm.
exists around legal for lots of reasons that the American Bar Association can tell you better than I, um, that they sit there.
Yeah.
What I compare it to when you're a compliance person, and especially if you're in any one of the many fields that have spun off from compliance,
Mhm.
like trust, like safety, like privacy, like security, you're essentially not just the translator, but you're a buffer for them as well.
Mhm.
And in a lot of cases, that manifests in kind of two interesting metaphoric ways I'll give you. I got a traffic ticket the other day, and
Oh
that
no.
traffic ticket was exactly 7 clicks over the speed limit, which irritates the hell out of me, but that's a separate story. I took that to my attorney and said, like, I want you to fight this. He goes off and does his magic, knowing the court system, representing me, figuring out what a good balance is, and will come back to me and say, I can get it down to 2. Here's your fine. You know, there's going
Mhm.
to be a penalty, etc. He knows that system.
Yeah.
And it's worthwhile to me to invest the money in him to know that system to save me having to pay for my insurance rates, right?
Mhm.
That's his function. I think the corollary in the compliance space is kind of like the lawyers who write the laws for the FAA for planes, right? These are the
Yeah.
standards that must be in place. But you don't want that lawyer flying your plane. And
Right,
that's
right.
the difference.
Yeah.
Like, to me, the compliance person, the master's degree takes you out of writing the nuances of the regulations, practicing within the system those regulations are enforced, and moves you to dealing with the day-to-day reality of executing them
Yeah.
and having to find a constant balance in that execution. Like, you can be damn sure that that pilot who landed the plane in the Hudson River didn't have an FAA requirement that said that you should do this.
Right.
I'm pretty sure it said you shouldn't.
Yeah.
But you know, he
Right.
at the time, you got to make a decision, and it's got to be educated, it's got to be thoughtful. But at the end of the day, it has to be risk-based and it has to be
Mhm.
justifiable, right? And that's the fluidity that you can have when you don't have JD
Yep.
attached to your name, right?
Yeah. No,
So
I think that's a really, really great analogy. Um, I mean, I think it actually, I mean, it's a good segue into kind of this next, like, how then do you, when you think about like all these emerging technologies, do you approach compliance differently? Does it change how you ask those questions and think about the solutions?
um, you know, I think I think I've evolved my thinking on this. My instinctive reaction a few years ago would have been to say, absolutely, it does, because you have to respond to the environment. The technology is going to continue to change. You need to evolve with it. But if you go back to the first principles of compliance, I mean, even the stuff that was written in like the 40s with the Department of Justice setting out what a
Mhm.
compliance program should be, it it's sustainable. It's still applicable. I mean, there's nuance in there that you need to change. But if you stick with that basic principle of we're here to be a check and balance, we're here to be sober second thought, we're looking for collateral damage, unintended consequences, potential risks that you haven't thought about because you don't exist in this broader space that we do. I don't think that part has changed. I
Yeah.
think when you get into the details, say in the privacy space, for me, I look at and have always looked at starting with the data subject. When you are collecting information from them, what are the issues? Does AI mess with that? Absolutely. But you're still asking the same question. Like, how is AI collecting that data, creating that data? about that person. And you start there and you work your way through. How is it being used? Where is it going? How long are we keeping it? How are we destroying it? Who are we sharing it with? And where does it end up when the whole life cycle is over? You have to build in new questions now. I mean, I find myself asking things like, does your large language model ever get rid of any training data? Ubiquitously so far, the answer is no, because then they have to retrain the whole thing from scratch,
Right.
which, as a retention person gives me the willies because you
Yeah.
have to get rid of that data.
Mm-hmm.
But with your compliance hat on, that makes perfect sense because you
Sure.
can't cripple that model if it's the basis of your business, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you have to find a solution and you have to start thinking about what does that look like. So perhaps it's not the questions change, but the answers change.
No, that's a good, I like that framework. I think too, from a business standpoint, like putting my business hat on, I'm thinking if I'm in the compliance space and I'm asking from an ethical standpoint, right? And I have to triage, okay, well, the business, the business model relies on this large language model keeping this information, but the customer, right? What's right for the customer? And if the consumer needs for us to purge this information, and how do you balance those, right? And then what sort of transparency do we owe the consumer, right? And what, in the 40-page terms of service, right? How far do we bury that down? How often are we notifying our consumers? I mean, all of those things, right? I mean, I'm an attorney. I don't read the terms of service, right? I gloss over them, scroll and click. And yeah, that's a real challenge. How do you balance all of those things?
I think it's really difficult. And I think one of the things that has always been helpful to me, perhaps because of where I was educated and most of my postgrad education was in Canada, we have a long-standing legal principle called the reasonable person test. And
Yeah.
it shows up in various other forms and you'll see
Mhm.
it. But as a non-lawyer, it's one of the most effective ways
Yeah.
to approach compliance problems because you can visualize in your head like your 5-year-old nephew, your best friend, your cousin,
Mhm.
the guy down at the store that you bumped into, like just pick a person
Mhm.
and start to try to explain what's happening in the system and
Right.
gauge reaction. I mean, and I have those conversations all the time. That's another great thing about not being a lawyer is I get to talk about it. So, I can engage with, hey, I'm hanging out at the bar having a drink with my friends. What would you guys think if I told you that blah, 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 blah,
Yeah.
blah? And you do get honest, real reactions. And in a
Mhm.
lot of cases, people kind of go, yeah, I mean, I sort of expected that, or yeah, that's okay with me, or no, that doesn't bother me. Because, like with everything, there's a bell curve of preferences here. And if
Right.
you're not an impacted community who suffered directly from the impact of this technology, then chances are you're probably okay with whatever is actually happening as long as Instagram works when you open it and your email doesn't automatically put events on your calendar that you don't want your partner to know about or whatever it is, right? Like, it should be fine. But it's the edge cases
Yeah.
that we get to look for. And those to me are the fun things.
Oh my gosh, the things that you think about that I like take for granted, right? Like, yes, that happens.
Mm,
Totally, right?
Yep,
That's so
yep,
funny.
yep.
Um, so last kind of thought before we wrap up, and certainly please feel free to ask questions if you're online with us. What emerging trends should we be looking for in as compliance professionals or even as consumers, right? What should we be looking for in this space?
I think one of the things I tell everyone to be wary of is whatever term you're hearing everyone use these days and really trying to understand what it is. So I'm sure you are all as equally sick as I am of hearing about Gen AI. And and I think a lot of it isn't because it isn't new technology or it's interesting or different. It's because it's the latest thing that we have grokked onto a name that people understand, which leads to a concept that people think they understand and can wrap their heads around. And then various toys in the iStore or the Android store that we can all play with.
Mhm.
I think you can't be distracted by the new shiny thing if you're in compliance. You really need to keep coming back to what the basic principles are and what you're looking for and stay focused on those things. They do apply to every piece of new technology out there, and the rigor of that thinking is one that I frankly personally learned in my master's program, because it was a consistent requirement in the assignments, in the paper, in the research, in the conversations, the presentations, and you get, it becomes muscle memory at that point. You just sort of learn how to approach these problems. I think the other piece, though, as a consumer, is to be aware that you have effectively at this point lost control of your data. And so the conversation needs to become, what do we do about that? And what can we get out of it for ourselves? We spend a lot of time talking about how all of these AI models have been taught by scraping all of our data off various sources in the internet. We'll see what the results of Scarlett Johansson's lawsuit will be against OpenAI, and we'll see if that sets a precedent, which is interesting and may result in some monetary compensation, but it's too late. Like, the data is now there. It's part of the model. It's part of the product. So we need to move away from the notion that there is such a thing as informed consent at this point when we deal with these new technologies. We have to move to focusing on acceptable uses. What do we want the outcomes to be? What are the potential social implications of the use of these tools at scale? Do we really want the tool telling the police which neighborhoods to patrol more versus their own lived experience on the street, or what a community group asks of them? Those are the questions we need to shift to. And a compliance person is actually really well positioned for those conversations, because you're aware of the stakeholders, you're aware of the partners, you're aware of where the data is going, you're aware of the incidents, the breaches, the history around all of that. And you can tell those stories, and that helps people have the conversation.
Yeah, no, I think that's really that's super important. I have one kind of like tag along comment, and then we've got one question. I think the other thing, and this is an emerging trend, not specifically in the technology space of this, but in the legal space. I find it fascinating that in the wake of all of these technology changes, legally, and then certainly like the compliance component of this, I think that in a way that we've never really seen in history, right? We've got these common law countries, right? So like the US, Canada, many other countries kind of like derive from the English common law, and our process of precedent and cases flow from the same sort of historical format. But because these companies, right, Google, Facebook, Microsoft, are so international, and we've seen the European Union take lead on so many privacy issues that states in the US and Canada and like other countries are following. I think that we're seeing this internationalization of law in a way that is a little bit unprecedented, right? Like, so the EU makes a move, California follows, and we're going to see, I think, not only then, speaking of my my hub just picked up my I know, right? I should have turned my mic off. I don't have the other device. I have the hub in my office, but so my but I think that we're going to see not only the companies then start to initiate their own compliance programs, obviously like in relatively parallel formats across countries, and potentially then case law start to mirror each other across countries, right? So it's just going to be an interesting sort of like internationalization in a way that we just haven't really seen before. So that'll be really fascinating as an attorney.
It really will. I mean, and I think the closest comparison is the attempts in the 80s around global movements on climate change. That's the only other thing that we've ever tried to do globally. So
so interesting question. Do you see any public health or population health implications with regard to the intersection of AI and compliance?
Oh, I love this question. So my little Canadian heart goes pitter patter because I'm working with a number of health tech startups in Canada, and that's exactly the argument they're making is the government has access writ large, province by province, to a massive amount of public health data. And right now that manifests in things like, for example, in Canada, if I go to my GP for my yearly physical, they automatically test me for a whole plethora of sexually transmitted diseases and whatever the common latest outbreak is in
Mhm.
my neighborhood. I don't ask for those test results, which I know under any other system seems kind of weird, but the reason they're doing it is for public health planning, right? And the whole notion that you can get trending and analysis, and if there's going to be an outbreak of syphilis here,
Interesting.
then they can start to treat there. Um, I think that's brilliant. I love that idea. I think at AI, using AI technology, we could begin to look at that for infectious diseases. We could look at that for rare diseases. We could look at that for really expensive diseases to treat. And I'm starting to see bits and pieces of that in Canada. There are some legal hurdles to that
Yeah.
because the use of that data
For
is
sure.
very much locked down, which presents some interesting problems. I think, though, what you bump into when you take it out of a publicly funded healthcare system is a whole different
Yeah.
set of normative,
Yep.
social, legal, ethical, like you name it,
For
issues,
sure.
right? I mean, there is a reason why there's a Genetic Privacy Act in the United States. That's based on a lot of people, specifically Henrietta Law, whose data was used for profit by pharmaceutical companies, and they never saw a dime of it because their data was owned by someone
Yeah.
else. So I think there's huge potential. I think we have a bunch of other hurdles that we need to start dealing with very quickly in order to realize some of that potential.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. Yeah, totally. I don't see any other questions unless anybody has any. Um, but this was amazing. Oh my gosh, I feel like I could talk for hours about this. Just some quick notes. So for those of us, or so for those of you who are interested, just quick dates coming up. Our deadline for scholarship applications and applications for the program is July 1 if you want to be prioritized for scholarships. Classes for fall are beginning September 3rd. I'm going to put up my contact information, and then we've got one more question. We have a couple more questions. Okay, so I'm going to take these in reverse order. With government agencies expanding the use of outsourced systems to assist with various assistance programs for the public, what do you think could be the possible solutions to fill in the gaps between the existing AI regulations and data privacy and the possibility of the Public Records Act?
Oh,
So,
that's a great question. And
huge question.
yeah, I really love the direction you're headed. I mean, I think if I could wave a magic wand, the solution, frankly, is just publicly funded healthcare because it eliminates a lot of the discrimination, racism, bias, cost, access, justice issues around it. Assuming that we can't, and we need to operate within the paradigm we have. I think what you'll hear everybody say is we should create some more laws, right? Like have some more laws that protect rights, that protect individuals, etc. My problem with that is they often come into enforcement when the ship has sailed. So I think the answer is to look at some of the really interesting cutting edge technology that's coming out now that's around the metadata tagging of sensitive information. And then you can write technical rules on the use of that data. So when I talk about policy in that context, what I'm talking about is a machine readable programmatic policy where we allow the machine to do the things the machine will do, and we write rules per data element at scale that would require it to respect the collection, use, and disclosure of that data. So we could potentially get to a place where it would be anonymized automatically in the system, and the useful aspects of my personal health record could be integrated into a larger public health system to do predictive trending, to do response, to do, the COVID planning for the next COVID, but none of it is linked to specific
Individuals.
yeah. And
Yeah.
that's ultimately the solution. We're going to have to start to invest in those really technical answers to some of these questions.
I wonder, I mean, my gosh, like you think about that, at scale internationally and what we could do to really help third world countries with some of the challenges that they face. I mean, that we just can't even fathom.
Mhm.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Any resources to explore public health implications around this? Do you have any off the top of your head? I know, right?
Yeah, actually, off the top of my head, I have a couple, but I'd really rather refer you to two papers that I know that have been addressing this issue specifically and how to do public health and predictive health modeling. So, Kelly, maybe I could send them
Yeah.
to you and you could disseminate after?
Yeah,
Okay.
feel free. And the person who asked it anonymously, but my contact information is up there. So if you want to send me an email, and I can send them out, that would be great.
Yeah, perfect. Happy to.
Perfect. Awesome. Well, thank you all so much for joining us, Tracy. I cannot thank you enough. This was amazing. This
Thank
was
you.
fantastic. So thank you all so much for joining us. Tracy, thank you again for your time, and I hope you all have a really great day.
Thanks
All
so much.
right.
Bye,
Yeah,
guys.
take care. Bye-bye.